I thought this was an interesting story from the book The Hidden Half of Nature. It's about the man who discovered microbes. His name was Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. When he was 16 years old, he became an apprentice to a cloth merchant, and in that merchant's shop, he saw his first microscope. Cloth merchants used microscopes back then so they could really inspect close up the weave and, the quality of the cloth. After being an apprentice for 6 years, he went back to his hometown and set up his own drapery store. But as the years went by, he became more and more interested in grinding better lenses so he could inspect his merchandise. He became fascinated with the lens itself and the use of a lens to see things up close. Then in 1665, somebody published the world's first scientific bestseller. This guy had looked at fleas and other tiny creatures under a microscope and drawn them. And Leeuwenhoek thought this was fascinating. And he became kind of obsessed with getting better and better lenses to see smaller and smaller things. He would go visit people who made lenses like spectacles and learned metalworking. He eventually made his lenses mounted on basically a microscope-like thing. He ended up in his little tinker shop making the most powerful microscope that existed and started looking at smaller things than anybody had ever seen. He did all kinds of what his neighbors thought were weird things. Like he dissected the head of a fly and was, fascinated by how complex it was. His neighbors basically thought he was crazy, but he didn't really care. He was really absorbed in this fascinating world. And he didn't tell anybody, really. He didn't try to publicize his efforts or anything. It was just basically for his own entertainment. And one day, a friend of his, who happened to be somebody that corresponded with the London's Royal Society, peered through his microscopes and was blown away. The best lenses of the day could magnify things several times. His magnified things like 200 times. This friend of his then wrote to the Royal Society and told them about it. Then one day he decided he was curious about what made the water in a pond kind of milky green. So he took some home and looked at it under his microscope to see if he could see anything. And he saw tiny green filaments made of little globules joined together in kind of a string. Also, he found that there were little creatures of some type moving around in this murky green water. Then he took some rainwater and looked at it under there. The rainwater had been sitting around for 4 days, and there were all kinds of things in there moving around. Little blob-like things and stick-like things and corkscrew-shaped things and little creatures moving around. He had no idea what they were or where they came from. Did they fall from the sky? Did they live on the ground where the raindrops fell? What were they? He had made one of the most important discoveries in the history of science, but he didn't tell anybody about it. And he wasn't a scientist. He was just curious. He did all kinds of things. He soaked some pepper, because there was a theory at the time that the reason black pepper was spicy is that it had little barbs in it. So he soaked some peppercorns in water and then looked at them under a microscope, and he didn't see any barbs. But he did see a bunch of little, what he called animalcules, little tiny creatures moving around in there. He tried looking at raindrops, and there's all these things moving around in there. So he got kind of excited about this. It was just so interesting. And so he wrote to the Royal Society himself and told them what he had seen in a drop of water, and they thought it was just crazy. They scoffed. They didn't believe him. It was one of those things that everybody knew, that the smallest creature in existence was an almost invisible cheese mite. The Royal Society was, of course, skeptical and, wrote him and said, well, tell us how you made your microscope and we'll see if we can duplicate it. Well, he didn't want to share how he made his microscope. Those were his secrets. So the Royal Society, they didn't really know what to do. And there was a famous guy, the guy that actually had written that book that really intrigued Leeuwenhoek earlier in his life, the drawings of fleas and other tiny creatures. They asked that guy, the author of that book, to make the best, most powerful microscope he could possibly make and bring it in to the Royal Society, and they would see what they could see. And they were astounded at what they saw in this microscope. They decided to elect Leeuwenhoek as a fellow in the Royal Society. He kept playing around with it, Leeuwenhoek, just seeing what he could see, scraped his teeth, put that under microscope, saw all kinds of things. Then he drank some hot coffee and scraped his teeth, and there was a lot fewer little animals moving around in there. He'd found out that the heat had killed some of them. He tried all kinds of things put under his microscope. He was the first one to discover blood cells and sperm cells. He became kind of a celebrity. Famous people would come and want to peer through his microscopes, his magic microscopes. He'd spent his whole life fascinated by these things and improving his lenses. And then on his deathbed, he dictated a letter to the Royal Society through his daughter and told them how he made his microscopes. And to the very end, he never realized that these little organisms had anything to do with everyday life. They were just interesting. It wasn't until like 100 years later that they discovered that these little animalcules are what turn barley into beer and make meat spoil. And eventually, of course, we've discovered that microbes are not inconsequential in the slightest. They are, in a way, the world is a world of microbes that we have evolved in. They've been here way longer than we have, and they are throughout our bodies and playing important functions in our own health and even in our attitude. Yeah, they've discovered that a particular kind of bacteria in your guts can change how anxious you are. Microbes have an effect on your immune system. They have an effect on everything. And yet the guy who discovered them never knew it. He just thought they were fascinating. His name was Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started.